All right, good morning, everyone. As folks kind of trickle into the video meeting, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. We won't be formally starting for another minute or two, but as you can see on the screen, we are doing this as a meeting to hopefully facilitate better engagement. To ensure the success of this situation, please mute your audio and also enable speaker view in the upper corner of your screen. In order to best see the presenters. If you have any questions or problems on how to access speaker view, please leave those and please feel free to send us a comment. And Lauren, our wonderful logistics coordinator here, will hopefully be able to talk you through it. And just also as a reminder, these presentations are being recorded. So just keep that in mind as we go forward, and we'll get started in a few minutes. All right, well, to keep us going on time today, we'll kick this off. Good morning, everyone. I'm Hannah Downey. I'm from PERC, the Property and Environment Research Center. I'm the policy director there. And we're excited this morning to be hosting a webinar looking at the Endangered Species Act and critical habitat designations. So through the Endangered Species Act and its ensuing regulations, they're highly contentious, as I'm sure most of you are aware. And most everyone can agree that providing habitat is essential to recovering these endangered species. Where things get really tricky is looking at how to harness the power of incentives to promote critical habitat. So earlier this summer, PERC, a conservation research group dedicated to using markets and property rights to solve environmental problems, the Pacific Legal Foundation, a nonprofit legal organization that defends liberty and constitutional rights, and the Center for Growth and Opportunity, a research organization exploring how institutions can ignite economic growth and increase opportunities, all came together and brought together a group of researchers to explore how we can better improve how we manage critical habitat designations under the Endangered Species Act. So then this past month, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced a proposed rule codifying and modifying when they can exclude particular areas from formal critical habitat designations. So today with this policy briefing, we're here to kind of bring these two events together. We're going to hear from some experts, Jake Lee and Jonathan Wood, who will explain more about what critical habitat is and what the proposed rule change is, as well as ideas from their research on where we can go from here to ensure that we're not only preventing extinction of endangered species, but also actively promoting their recovery. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our presenters today. Jonathan Wood is a lawyer with the Pacific Legal Foundation and a fellow here at PERC, where he's committed to finding effective, fair, and constitutional solutions to environmental problems. Jake Lee is the Director for Biodiversity at the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, sometimes known as EPIC, where he's an expert on engaging the public and private sectors to save endangered species. I can promise you that you have much to learn from them, as I have as well. So on a quick logistics note, please remember this video is being recorded. Please mute your microphones and enable speaker view, which is in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And we'll keep this to a quick half hour. When programming ends, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions if you choose to stick around, or we will also share the contact information of our panelists so you can reach out to them personally. With that in mind, I'll hand it over to Jonathan to provide some background on critical habitat and the proposed rule.
Thanks, Hannah, and good morning, everyone, especially those of you out west. I realize this is quite early for a ESA discussion, so I'm glad so many of you are able to join us. I'll keep my introductory remarks brief because I'm sure most of you have already understand quite a bit about the ESA and the critical habitat, and that'll leave as much time as possible for the meat of our meeting. One of the Endangered Species Act's most significant and controversial provisions concerns the designation of critical habitat, habitat areas deemed essential for the recovery of species. Whether land is publicly owned, privately owned, occupied by the species, or unoccupied, all of these areas are subject to potential designation, which can have impacts not only for species, but also for individual landowners. Designations may reduce the market value of land, may restrict activities occurring on that land, but ideally will also incentivize the conservation of habitat and perhaps even restoration of habitat. In the wake of the Supreme Court's Tennessee Valley Authority versus Hill decision, which interpreted this ESA to adopt a whatever the cost approach to recovering species, Congress amended the critical habitat provisions of the ESA, specifically directing that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service, quote, must take into consideration economic and other impacts when designating critical habitat. And Congress specifically authorized these agencies to, quote, exclude any area where the benefits of exclusion outweigh the benefits of inclusion, unless the exclusion would result in the extinction of the species. So this is one of the areas of the ESA where Congress has clearly rejected the whatever the cost approach, and instead encouraged active consideration of trade-offs. What are the conservation benefits of doing this, and what are the economic consequences? However, there's long been dissatisfaction with the implementation of these provisions, and a perception among landowners, states, and others that the service doesn't feel obligated and perhaps isn't fairly calculating and evaluating the conservation benefits versus the cost. The current proposal is likewise a response to a Supreme Court case in Weyerhaeuser versus U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The Supreme Court considered the designation of 1,500 acres of private land in Louisiana as critical habitat for a frog, the dusky gopher frog, an endangered species that had not been seen in the state in over half a century, and the landowners contended could not be relocated to the property without substantial improvement and modification. Several of the habitat requirements for the species were not present on the property at the time. The Supreme Court held first that only land that is habitat qualifies for designation as critical habitat. That is an issue addressed in a different rule proposed this summer. But the second part of the court's holding is that landowners and others can challenge agency decisions whether to include or exclude land from a critical habitat designation. To provide greater transparency and certainty, and thereby reduce the risk that a court would decide that an inclusion or exclusion is arbitrary and capricious, the service has proposed a rule to basically govern how it will consider the conservation and economic effects when designating critical habitat. One of the most significant changes is that whenever a critical habitat designation is proposed, the service will explain exactly what economic impacts it anticipates could happen from that sort of designation, basically giving guidance to landowners and others who may only have, say, 30 days to prepare comments of what type of factors they should be thinking about and what sort of costs could result from the designation if completed. Previously, the service would have some of those costs in mind, but they'd be in a separate economic analysis and maybe only referenced briefly in a proposed rule. The proposed rule also provides standards for when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will perform an exclusion analysis, including whenever anyone requests their land be excluded and presents, quote, credible information to suggest that that may be worthwhile here. And second, whenever the agency decides as a discretionary matter to perform an exclusion analysis. Even when the service decides not to do the exclusion analysis, it recognizes that the statute and the Supreme Court's decision imposes a burden on it to provide at least a minimal amount of information to explain why the economic and other impacts didn't merit an exclusion analysis in that particular case. The proposed rule also provides for how the service will consider those impacts based on its expertise relative to commentators. So one of the things that's good to see in the proposed rule is that it acknowledges the incredible amount of expertise that the agency has in implementing the ESA, evaluating conservation benefits and costs, but also admits that it's not well suited necessarily to know what the economic impacts of a critical habitat designation may be. States may have plans for the land, landowners may have plans for the land that will be obstructed, and the service is not in a very good position to know what those plans may be. So the proposed rule would basically create a rebuttable presumption that the information provided by tribes, states, and landowners is correct, and the agency would have to explain why it's not crediting information submitted by those commentors. And finally, and most significantly, the proposed rule would establish that the service will exclude areas from critical habitat whenever, quote, the benefits of exclusion outweigh the benefits of inclusion. Previously, the service had an informal and extremely vague disproportionate cost standard for exclusion, so that in theory, it could impose a designation of critical habitat even if the costs exceeded the benefits, so long as they didn't exceed it by too much. And no one ever really knew what too much was. And given some of the uncertainty in how you calculate conservation benefits versus economic costs, which I'm sure we'll get into later in the meat of the program, having a vague standard like that complicates things considerably. From the perspective of a landowner, a state, or even a conservation group who is trying to get their desired outcome in the critical habitat process, it can be difficult to know exactly how much and what information you need to submit and how to characterize it in order to meet a standard like that. And so that's basically a short description of what's in the rule. We have still a couple of weeks left until comments are due. But anyone considering comments, one of the most important things to keep in mind is that just saying, I like the rule, I don't like the rule, isn't generally helpful. Agencies largely just say thanks or we disagree. They don't have any obligation to respond to those sorts of things. So instead, to be able to actually be most impactful, it's important to explain what you see as good or bad in the proposed policies and what additional changes you would like to see to the proposed rule. The standard governing changes to a proposal like this are logical outgrowth, which leaves a lot of room for the agency and for commenters to say, this is a great starting point, but here are the additional details you should iron out in order to make the rule most effective. And with that, I look forward to the commentary between me and Jake.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jonathan. And I see we're getting a few comments in the chat, maybe looking for specifics on where to find the public comment and where to be able to actually submit your public comment. I'll be sharing some of those links at the end and a little overview on some of the nuts and bolts of how to actually go about submitting your comment. So I see that folks are chiming in and helping each other out, so that's really helpful, but we'll continue to get to that later as well. So now I think what's most interesting is Jonathan shared a little bit about what's actually in this proposed rule, but now I think it's worth taking a look at what does the rule actually do? What would it mean for conservation outcomes on the ground? And so Jake and Jonathan are both incredible experts at looking at how do we get the incentives right for conservation? How do we properly involve and motivate private landowners to provide the habitat that's so essential for the recovery of these endangered species? So these guys are great experts, and I'm sure they'll give us a lot to chew on and potentially submit in our public comments. So just to kick it off, Jake, maybe we can start with you. But how do you think this proposed rule will clarify the process of designating critical habitat? And as part of that, will it actually benefit species conservation?
Thanks for the question, Hannah. Let me answer those questions in the order you presented. The first one, in terms of clarification, I actually agree with what Jonathan said earlier, that I think this rule does offer more transparency about how the agency will carry out its 4B2 exclusion analysis. In particular, the Fish and Wildlife Service has put, for the first time ever in its regulations, the factors as to when it will enter into the exclusion analysis. So that's more transparent. And then as part of the exclusion analysis, the service has explained that it will assign more weight to experts in the field. This is sometimes called a weight of evidence approach, and it's widely used actually in the human health context. So I think those are, minor improvements in the transparency of the 4B2 exclusion process. Next, I wanted to answer your second question about what will be the potential impacts on conservation. And that's the question of greatest interest to me. I think we can really only see the tip of the iceberg in the few minutes we have here, because this is actually a really complex topic that's still the subject of debate within the conservation community. But my overall perspective is that this proposal will probably increase the likelihood of areas being excluded from critical habitat, although perhaps not by a huge margin. And I say that for two main reasons. The first is that the Fish and Wildlife Service has, for the first time ever, adopted a policy or proposed to adopt a policy that says, if the benefits of exclusion outweigh the benefits of inclusion, then the agency, quote unquote, shall exclude that area. So it's not discretionary anymore like it used to be. Under a prior practice, although that's still current practice, the Fish and Wildlife Service basically adopts the standard that its general practice is to exclude an area if the benefits of exclusion outweigh the benefits of inclusion. So what the agency is basically doing is saying it's our general practice to exclude areas, and then moving it to we shall exclude those areas if the benefits outweigh if exclusion outweigh the benefits of inclusion. So then the question is, how much of a difference does this really make in the real world? My best guess is that it's probably not going to be a huge difference, because my observation thus far is that when the service determines that the benefits of exclusion outweigh the benefits of inclusion in the past, it basically already excludes those areas anyway. So changing it from a discretionary to a mandatory standard, I don't think on numbers alone are going to change the rate of exclusion significantly. I think where it's going to probably make the biggest difference is in very controversial situations like we saw for the dusky gopher frog, where the service previously had the ability to use its discretion to still include an area as critical habitat, even when the analysis favors exclusion. Under the proposed policy, the agency now will be forced to exclude those areas, right? It really can't exercise its discretion as much anymore to still include an area. So I see that as, potentially worrisome from a conservation standpoint. And then real briefly, the second thing that worries me more is that the proposed policy no longer automatically excludes or creates a presumption of exclusion for federal lands. So under the prior policy that the Obama administration adopted, the Fish and Wildlife Service basically said that federal lands will presumably be included in critical habitat. And now this proposal rescinds that policy. And I think this is worth pausing on, because if critical habitat makes any real difference in the real world, it's mostly going to be on federal lands, in my mind, because the protections for critical habitat only occur through the Section 7 consultation process that prohibits destruction or adverse modification of critical habitat. And so that's going to be more frequently triggered on federal lands. So if you reduce the frequency of critical habitat designation on federal lands, I think you also end up reducing the frequency of the destruction or adverse modification prohibition being triggered and evaluated. And therefore that may lead to, somewhat less conservation on federal lands. I think that's probably the more consequential outcome for conservation. So let me pause there. I have a few other broader comments, but I maybe want to give Jonathan a turn to offer his perspectives as well.
Well, let me start with saying something I imagine I'll say a lot today. I agree with pretty much everything Jake just said. I didn't mention the change in federal land, and probably should have, but Jake's right that could be really significant. If you look at past studies on the effect of critical habitat, the evidence that it has meaningful conservation benefits on private land is really mixed. And my sense is overall sort of negative, that the incentive effects of punishing landowners for conserving or restoring critical habitat outweigh the benefits that regulation may have in discouraging activity that would damage that habitat. But the same doesn't hold for federal land. And so the reason for that is that critical habitat designation doesn't automatically prevent you from using your land. But if any activity on the land has a federal nexus, it requires a federal permit or federal funding, then you face increased scrutiny and likely increased mitigation requirements. And federal land always has that federal nexus. So study after study shows that critical habitat does seem to have really meaningful impacts on federal land. The new rule, as I read it, doesn't require federal land to be excluded in these circumstances, but does allow for people that say hold a mining permit or a grazing lease to say that this designation will harm my interest and you should exclude it for the following reasons. And Jake's right that to the extent that results in less federal land being included, I expect you will see some increased loss of habitat there. In terms of the overall effect of the change, I think it likely will reduce conflict. As Jake said, it will get rid of the sort of outlier case like the dusky gopher frog, where the agency previously might have exercised its discretion to designate land, even though the cost-benefit analysis was sort of out of kilter. And that's a good thing, but it won't solve the underlying incentive problem with critical habitat designation. As I mentioned, critical habitat designation can lower the value of private property. It can restrict plans that the landowners have for their property. And as a result, it in effect imposes pretty significant negative consequences for landowners who have conserved habitat or who may be otherwise willing to restore habitat. And unfortunately, it has nothing on the other side of the ledger to reward landowners who conserve or restore habitat. It is primarily punitive. And so while I think getting rid of that conflict is great and something to be praised, really solving the underlying incentive problem requires something else to provide incentives to landowners to conserve and restore habitat. That's beyond the scope of this rule, but if you're concerned with conservation outcomes, that's the critical part that has to be solved.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for those kind of reactions to the rule as it is. I think, Jonathan, as you mentioned originally, part of the beauty with these public comment periods is it's an opportunity for interested parties to weigh in and say, here's how you can improve this proposal. Here's where we can go from here. And I think you both have kind of clearly outlined what this rule does or doesn't do to some extent. So now I wanted to ask you guys kind of, I know you both have researched ways to actually make a lot of these things better. As you guys are looking at potentially submitting public comments or working with Fish and Wildlife Service to actually improve the regulations related to the Endangered Species Act, what would you suggest? Where should we go from here? I appreciate that's a very loaded question, but Jonathan, you talked a lot about the incentives. Do you have any ideas on how we might be able to start getting those incentives better to actually promote conservation? And Jake, I'd also love to hear your response on this.
Well, I know Jake's done a lot of work on this, so I won't hog too much of the time. But I think the critical step, and something that is, I think, a fair issue for commenters to raise, is to tighten the way the services evaluate conservation benefits and economic costs. If you review enough critical habitat designations, you start to notice certain trends, including that the conservation benefits are often treated as speculative and uncertain, and therefore not always described very well. So often the agencies say, we don't really know what impacts this will have because we don't know whether the federal nexus will be there, whether a federal permit will be needed. So while we think that there are conservation benefits here, we're really not sure what they are and don't know how to necessarily quantify them. And then on the other side, on the costs, agencies tend to minimize those by instead attributing as much cost as possible to the listing decision or the take prohibition, even in circumstances where that probably doesn't make sense. So one recent critical habitat decision for the black pine snake acknowledged that the snake may not be everywhere that's being designated as critical habitat, and not all habitat modification would result in take. Yet when it came time to do the exclusion analysis and the cost and benefit analysis, the service still assumed that all of the economic costs, or almost all of them, would be attributed to the take prohibition. I think this rule indirectly will help to solve that problem, because in the wake of Weyerhaeuser, we have the first time that exclusion analysis will be judicially reviewable. The agencies feel, I think, more of an obligation to have a formal process and to explain what those cost and benefits are and to prove them. But I think commenters absolutely should address how they think agencies should consider where are the conservation benefits really, what circumstances make sense for critical habitat, and then where are the economic costs, what circumstances make sense for exclusion. With that, I'll turn it over to Jake. You're muted, Jake.
Looks like I'm muted. Great. Thanks, Jonathan. I largely agree with what you said. I just wanted to make some finer points around sort of the issue of how do you calculate costs and benefits. And I'm sort of with you that after reading many critical habitat rules for quite a number of years, I think the number one sort of pattern that jumps out to me from a conservation standpoint is that the agency, I think, does a decent job identifying the potential economic cost to landowners and businesses. And even though that's a little speculative, I think it generally is somewhat comprehensive. What I think the agency continues to do a fairly poor job at is identifying the conservation benefits to including an area as critical habitat. And I think there are several reasons for this, and this isn't trying to be critical of the service. I actually think this is more of a methodological issue, that for many data poor species, and I think many listed species are data poor, the benefits are inherently difficult to monetize, right? So how do you really assign a dollar figure to designate an area as critical habitat, and then that leading to a Section 7 consultation that then leads to mitigation measures that then advances the species recovery by X amount, right? That's a really, really, really hard thing to do, I think. And so that's why I think looking at the benefits and the costs strictly from a monetary standpoint, actually, I think tends to short sell the conservation benefits of critical habitat. And so a more comprehensive, holistic way of looking at benefits and drawbacks of critical habitat, I think are needed. Let me sort of offer one hypothetical just to illustrate this. Let's say that the conservation value of designating an area could be monetized, and let's say it's $50,000. And then let's say the cost to the local economy could be monetized and it's $60,000. So looking at the numbers alone, one might conclude that the area should be excluded from critical habitat. But if you look beyond sort of the monetary value, you could consider, for example, whether that area happens to be one of the most important, right, pieces of habitat for the species. And if so, then I think that's a really important non-monetary consideration to add into the 4B2 exclusion analysis. I think what no proposed policy or final policy has ever done is to specify exactly how those conservation interests will be weighed against non-conservation interest, right? So it's not just a matter of, is it $50,000 versus $60,000, but it's a matter of which one is more important, because $50,000 might be a lower number, but if you assign it a greater weight, then it could become more important than a $60,000 impact to the local economy. So I think that remains really opaque. And I don't actually really even see much of an attempt in the preamble to the proposed policy to explain how that would work. I think that's probably beyond the scope of what the service can accomplish in this particular rulemaking, but I do think it is a longer term sort of advancement in decision science that's really needed. So I'll turn it back over to all of you. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. I think you certainly gave the audience lots to think about in terms of, what do we have in a proposal? Where do we go from here? How do we work on incentives and weighting and modeling and all of these things to ensure that we're actually promoting conservation outcomes on the ground and ensuring that our models and processes work to actually uphold those goals. So I know we've had a few questions on how to actually submit a public comment and where to find more information on this and to get a sense of what the service has actually kind of put forward and be able to read it yourselves. So I wanted to share with you guys quickly where you can find this information. So if you go to the federalregister.gov, you'll be able to find a whole long list of proposals and rules and all of these fun things that Jake and Jonathan spend a lot of time looking through. But so here, if you go here and you see, and if you search for the endangered and threatened wildlife and plants, and I'll share the docket number here in a second, you'll see there's a big green button that says submit a formal comment. Comments are due on October 8th. So if this is something you're interested in participating in, please just be aware of your time frame. And that being said, here's a little just screenshot directly from the website where you can find the docket number and instructions for how to both electronically and via hard copy submit your comments. I know that someone helpfully shared in the chat a link to this as well, so please feel free to just go and use that feature. So with that in mind, we do want to keep a consciousness of time and let you guys get back to your days. But we are all available to talk about this at greater length. This is kind of marks the formal end of our conversation today. I hope you have a lot to think about regarding critical habitat and how do we get the incentives right to actively not just prevent extinction, but also promote recovery and a better understanding of all the different factors that go into species recovery. It's not just, oh, this looks great, we can restore our habitat here, but there's competing demands on our landscapes and our resources. And so how we're able to effectively balance those so that we're upholding people's property rights, we're upholding kind of local communities while still promoting wildlife conservation. There's a lot of opportunity out there, and this is a really great opportunity to kind of share your voice and share your insights on how to best go about doing that. So here's a screen with some contact information for all of our panelists today. Jonathan and Jake are certainly experts, but if there's anything that I or PERC can do to help out, please feel free to reach out. Additionally, to note, a collection of the academic research papers that have kind of been discussed today and were mentioned in regards to the PERC Pacific Legal Foundation and Center for Growth and Opportunity workshop. Those will become available kind of this fall on the Center for Growth and Opportunities website. So be sure to check those out, and we'll try and flag those as they become published and peer reviewed. So with that in mind, this kind of marks the formal end of our programming today, but our panelists have graciously offered to stick around and help answer some questions if you have anything specific that you'd like to ask. So one way to do that would be to submit a comment in the chat box or to raise a hand, and Lauren will help call on you. So we're willing to stick around for a few minutes if you have anything you want to ask. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today. We so appreciate it, and please reach out with any questions.